In the misty hollows of New England, where ancient forests whisper secrets older than colonial memory, the Sinclair name has been spoken in hushed tones for over 3 centuries. Not out of respect, but from a deep, bone-chilling fear that has passed from generation to generation like a hereditary curse. The Sinclairs weren't just another prominent family who built their fortune through conventional means. They were something far more sinister, something that defied the natural order of things. Local historians refuse to document their complete story. Church records from the 1600s mysteriously vanish whenever researchers get too close to the truth. Even today, in our age of digital transparency and investigative journalism, the Sinclair legacy remains shrouded in deliberate obscurity. Those who know the full extent of their dark history understand why some knowledge is better left buried. The first recorded mention of the Sinclair family appears in a ship's manifest from 1692, though even this document raises more questions than it answers. The manifest lists 17 passengers aboard the merchant vessel Salem's Fortune, but only lists surnames for most entries. Curiously, it specifically notes the Sinclair brood as occupying the ship's lower cargo hold, an unusual arrangement that maritime historians find deeply troubling. The ship arrived in Boston Harbor during the height of the Salem witch trials, though the Sinclairs never disembarked in Massachusetts. Local Abenaki tribes had abandoned this territory decades earlier, leaving behind warnings carved into trees and symbols that linguists still cannot fully decipher. What makes the Sinclair arrival particularly unsettling is how quickly they established dominance in their new territory. Within a single winter, they had constructed not just a modest homestead, but an elaborate compound featuring multiple buildings arranged in a precise geometric pattern that served no apparent practical purpose. The central structure, according to surviving architectural sketches, contained a great hall with a ceiling that rose impossibly high for a building of its foundation size. Local carpenters who worked on the construction reported strange occurrences during the building process. Tools would be found arranged in ritualistic patterns each morning, despite being left scattered the previous evening. Workers reported hearing hammering and sawing sounds continuing throughout the night, yet no one was present on the site after sunset. Most disturbing were the building materials themselves. The Sinclairs insisted on using timber from a specific grove where trees grew in unnaturally straight lines, their bark bearing spiral patterns that seemed to move when observed peripherally. By 1695, the Sinclair compound had become a center of regional commerce, though their business practices defied economic logic. They appeared to possess unlimited resources despite having no visible means of generating income. Ships would arrive at their private dock under cover of darkness, unloading cargo that was immediately transported to underground storage areas. These vessels flew no flags and bore no identifying marks, leading customs officials to suspect smuggling operations. However, when authorities attempted to investigate, they encountered bureaucratic obstacles that seemed almost supernatural in their effectiveness. Investigation orders would be mysteriously rescinded. Key witnesses would suddenly refuse to testify, claiming they had been mistaken about what they observed. The Sinclair family structure itself violated social norms of colonial New England. Rather than following typical patriarchal patterns, the family appeared to be governed by a council of elders that included both men and women in equal numbers. They practiced no recognizable form of Christianity, despite the religious requirements of colonial society. When pressed by local ministers about their spiritual beliefs, the Sinclairs would respond with theological discussions so complex and esoteric that even educated clergy found themselves confused and unsettled. Their children presented another anomaly. Sinclair offspring appeared to age at irregular rates, with some reaching apparent adulthood within a few years, while others remained childlike for decades. They possessed uncanny intelligence, often demonstrating knowledge of subjects they could not possibly have studied. Local teachers reported that Sinclair children could read Latin and Greek without instruction, solve mathematical problems beyond their supposed grade level, and most unnervingly, seemed to know personal details about their instructors' private lives. The family's social interactions followed patterns that anthropologists would later describe as ritualistic rather than genuine. They attended community gatherings not to participate, but to observe. They would position themselves at strategic locations where they could monitor multiple conversations simultaneously. Witnesses noted that the Sinclairs never seemed to blink during these social observations, maintaining an intense focus that made other attendees profoundly uncomfortable. Their economic influence grew exponentially throughout the early 1700s. The Sinclairs somehow acquired ownership of vast tracts of land through transactions that legal scholars found technically valid but morally questionable. Previous landowners would sell their properties to the Sinclairs for far below market value, often claiming they felt compelled to complete the transactions despite having no intention of selling. These former landowners frequently left the region entirely shortly after completing their sales, many abandoning successful businesses and established social connections without explanation. The Sinclair compound continued expanding during this period, with new structures appearing seemingly overnight. Local craftsmen swore they had not worked on these buildings, yet the construction showed clear evidence of professional skill. The architectural style became increasingly elaborate and foreign, incorporating design elements that bore no resemblance to New England colonial traditions. Visitors described walking through corridors that seemed longer from the inside than the building's exterior dimensions could accommodate. Most unsettling were the sounds emanating from the compound during nighttime hours. Residents of the nearest settlement, located nearly 2 miles away, reported hearing what they described as gathering music carried on the wind. This wasn't conventional instrumental music, but rather a complex harmony of voices singing in languages that predated any known European or Native American traditions. The singing would continue from sunset until dawn, with the volume and intensity fluctuating in patterns that seemed to correspond with lunar phases and seasonal changes. Local wildlife behavior around the Sinclair property became increasingly aberrant. Domestic animals refused to graze within a half-mile radius of the compound. Wild birds would not fly over the property, instead making dramatic detours that added considerable distance to their migration routes. Hunters reported that game animals showed signs of extreme agitation when tracked near Sinclair boundaries, often injuring themselves in their desperation to flee the area. The family's business ventures expanded beyond regional commerce into areas that contemporary entrepreneurs found impossible to penetrate. The Sinclairs established trading relationships with merchants from distant ports who apparently traveled exclusively to conduct business with them. These visiting traders spoke languages that local interpreters could not identify and carried goods that customs officials could not properly categorize for taxation purposes. Documents from the period describe merchandise that seemed to shift in appearance depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. Fabrics that appeared to be simple wool would display intricate patterns when examined closely, patterns that seemed to move and change configuration. Metalwork pieces showed craftsmanship techniques that colonial smiths insisted were impossible to achieve with available tools and methods. The Sinclairs also demonstrated knowledge of navigation and astronomy that surpassed the expertise of professional ship captains and university-educated scholars. They maintained detailed charts of celestial movements that proved more accurate than official maritime references. Their predictions of weather patterns, tidal changes, and seasonal variations showed supernatural precision, allowing them to schedule business activities with remarkable efficiency. Religious authorities became increasingly concerned about the Sinclair family's influence on regional spiritual life. While they never openly challenged Christian doctrine, their presence seemed to create what ministers described as spiritual confusion among parishioners. Church attendance declined in areas near the Sinclair compound. Longtime believers began expressing doubts about fundamental theological concepts. Some parishioners reported experiencing vivid dreams featuring religious imagery that contradicted established biblical narratives. The few individuals who claimed to have been inside the Sinclair compound provided descriptions that varied so dramatically they seemed to be describing entirely different locations. Some spoke of elegant chambers filled with artwork and furnishings that rivaled European palaces. Others described stark, utilitarian spaces with stone walls and minimal decoration. Most disturbing were accounts of underground areas that allegedly extended far deeper than the local terrain should have permitted. These underground sections reportedly contained libraries with books written in scripts that predated known writing systems, laboratories equipped with apparatus that served no identifiable scientific purpose, and chambers designed for gatherings that could accommodate far more people than the Sinclair family contained. Visitors consistently reported feeling watched while in these underground areas, despite seeing no one present besides their Sinclair guides. The family's longevity became another source of regional speculation and fear. Colonial records indicate that the original Sinclair adults who arrived in 1692 remained active in community affairs well into the 1740s, showing no apparent signs of aging despite the passage of 5 decades. When questioned about their remarkable health and vitality, the Sinclairs would respond with explanations involving diet, exercise, and spiritual practices that sounded reasonable but never produced similar results when attempted by others. As the 18th century progressed, the Sinclair influence spread beyond their immediate geographic area into regional politics and commerce. Family members began appearing in official positions throughout Maine and the broader New England region, always through appointments that seemed legitimate but involved circumstances that political historians found highly irregular. These Sinclair appointees demonstrated competence that exceeded their apparent qualifications, often resolving complex problems that had stymied more experienced officials. Their political influence operated through subtle manipulation rather than direct confrontation. The Sinclairs would identify existing tensions within communities and then provide solutions that served their interests while appearing to benefit all parties involved. They possessed an uncanny ability to predict social and economic trends, positioning themselves advantageously before changes became apparent to others. The American Revolution period marked a significant shift in Sinclair operations, though their role in colonial resistance movements remains deliberately obscured in historical records. They provided financial support to independence efforts while simultaneously maintaining business relationships with British colonial authorities. This dual allegiance should have resulted in accusations of treason from both sides, yet the Sinclairs navigated the political turmoil without facing consequences from either revolutionary or loyalist forces. Their survival strategy seemed to involve information management rather than military might. The Sinclairs possessed intelligence about troop movements, supply routes, and strategic plans that enabled them to avoid conflicts while profiting from wartime commerce. They sold supplies to both Continental and British forces, somehow maintaining the trust of opposing military commanders who should have been suspicious of such arrangements. The post-revolutionary period brought new opportunities for Sinclair expansion as the young American nation struggled to establish stable institutions. The family leveraged their accumulated wealth and political connections to acquire additional properties and business interests throughout New England and into the expanding Western territories. Their influence grew to encompass banking, shipping, manufacturing, and land speculation on a scale that individual families rarely achieved. Yet their success continued to follow patterns that economists and historians found difficult to explain through conventional analysis. The Sinclairs seemed immune to market fluctuations that devastated other investors. Their business ventures succeeded even when similar enterprises failed under identical circumstances. They possessed advanced knowledge of political decisions that affected commerce, enabling them to position their investments optimally before information became public. As we delve deeper into the Sinclair legacy, the evidence reveals a family whose power transcended normal social, economic, and political boundaries. Their influence operated through mechanisms that challenged contemporary understanding of how power functioned in American society. The dawn of the 19th century brought unprecedented prosperity to the Sinclair dynasty, yet with it came a darkness that would forever alter the fabric of American society. As the young nation expanded westward and industrialization took hold, the Sinclairs evolved their methods, adapting ancient practices to modern opportunities. What emerged was not merely a family business empire, but something far more sinister, a network of influence that reached into the very heart of America's growing power structure. By 1820, the Sinclairs had established themselves as titans of industry, their ventures spanning from New England textile mills to southern cotton plantations, from Great Lakes shipping to western mining operations. Yet those who dared investigate their rapid expansion discovered patterns that defied conventional explanation. Mills that operated without workers during certain lunar phases. Plantations where crops flourished despite soil that should have been barren. Ships that arrived ahead of schedule despite contrary winds and impossible weather conditions. The truth was far more disturbing than mere business acumen. The Sinclairs had begun what they called the Great Harvesting, a systematic expansion of their supernatural influence across the expanding nation. Each new venture served as more than a source of wealth. It became a node in an intricate web of occult power that fed back to their ancestral seat on the Forsaken Shore. Their textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, became notorious for accidents that followed unnaturally precise patterns. Every 13th day of operation, machinery would malfunction in ways that claimed exactly one life. Workers reported that the looms seemed to weave patterns on their own during night shifts, creating designs that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing were the accounts of mill girls who claimed to hear voices emanating from the machinery itself, speaking in languages that predated human settlement in the region. The mill's production records reveal impossible output numbers. During months when other mills struggled with supply shortages and mechanical failures, Sinclair operations continued at full capacity. Investigators who examined the machinery found modifications that no engineer could explain, gears that rotated in ways that violated basic principles of mechanics, steam engines that produced power far exceeding their theoretical limits, and spindles that operated with a precision that seemed almost alive. In the South, the Sinclair plantation holdings presented an even more troubling picture. Purchased lands that previous owners had abandoned due to soil exhaustion suddenly became the region's most productive cotton fields. Neighboring planters noted that Sinclair crops grew in perfect rows that maintained exact geometric patterns visible from great distances. More unsettling were reports from enslaved individuals who spoke of rituals conducted in hidden chambers beneath the plantation houses. These accounts, preserved in letters smuggled north by abolitionists, described ceremonies where family members would descend into underground spaces carved from living rock. The enslaved workers reported being forced to participate in strange rites that left them with no memory of what transpired, only lingering dreams of vast underground chambers filled with symbols that seemed to move in torchlight. Those who attempted to escape the Sinclair plantations were invariably found days later, returned to the property with no recollection of their journey, bearing strange marks on their skin that resembled ritualistic scarification. The most chilling aspect of the Sinclair plantation operations was their apparent immunity to the diseases and natural disasters that plagued other agricultural ventures. When blight devastated cotton crops across the South in 1845, Sinclair fields remained untouched. During the yellow fever epidemic of 1853, not a single individual on Sinclair properties succumbed to the disease. Local physicians noted that even the enslaved population on these plantations exhibited unusual longevity and resistance to common ailments, though they also displayed behavioral changes that suggested some form of psychological conditioning. As America's transportation networks expanded, the Sinclairs positioned themselves at crucial junctions of commerce and communication. Their shipping operations on the Great Lakes commanded routes that other companies found mysteriously hazardous. Vessels attempting to compete with Sinclair ships encountered unexplained mechanical failures, navigational equipment that malfunctioned despite perfect weather conditions, and crews who reported sightings of impossible phenomena on the water. The Sinclair merchant fleet itself defied natural laws. Their ships consistently made passages in record time, even when weather conditions should have made such speeds impossible. Cargo manifests reveal shipments of materials that had no known source, including minerals that geologists claimed did not exist in North America, and textiles woven from fibers that could not be identified by any expert examination. Most disturbing were the crew logs, which contained entries written in multiple hands, but describing events that no single person could have witnessed. Port authorities in cities from Buffalo to Chicago began to notice patterns in Sinclair shipping schedules that coincided with unexplained phenomena in their communities. During weeks when Sinclair vessels were docked, local newspapers reported unusual numbers of missing persons, strange lights seen over the harbors at night, and mass sightings of what witnesses described as figures walking on the water's surface. These events were typically dismissed as hysteria or folklore, but the consistency of the reports across different cities suggested something far more systematic. The California gold rush of 1849 provided the Sinclairs with their most audacious opportunity yet. While thousands of prospectors struggled to extract modest amounts of gold from California's rivers and hills, Sinclair mining operations yielded unprecedented quantities of precious metals. Their claims, purchased from desperate miners who had found nothing but barren rock, suddenly became the most productive sites in the territory. Geological surveys of Sinclair mining properties revealed anomalies that challenged scientific understanding. Gold deposits appeared in rock formations where such metals should not exist. Mining shafts extended far deeper than safety regulations permitted, yet never experienced the cave-ins and flooding that plagued other operations. Most mysteriously, Sinclair mines produced not only gold, but rare minerals that had never been cataloged by American geological surveys. Workers at these mining operations reported experiences that bordered on the supernatural. Miners described hearing rhythmic chanting echoing from unexplored tunnels, finding tools arranged in ritualistic patterns after leaving them scattered at shift's end, and discovering carved symbols on tunnel walls that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Several miners claimed to have encountered other workers in the deepest shafts who spoke no recognizable language and wore clothing that appeared to be made from materials unknown in the 19th century. The wealth generated by these mining operations allowed the Sinclairs to expand their influence into American politics with unprecedented scope. By 1860, they had placed family members or allies in key positions throughout the federal government. Senate records from this period show voting patterns on crucial legislation that defy normal political alignments, with representatives from vastly different regions and parties suddenly supporting measures that benefited Sinclair interests. The family's political influence extended beyond mere lobbying or financial contributions. Congressional representatives who initially opposed Sinclair-backed legislation would experience sudden changes of perspective, often overnight, becoming passionate advocates for positions they had previously denounced. These politicians frequently reported shared dreams of vast underground chambers and entities that communicated without words, though they typically dismissed these experiences as stress-related hallucinations. Most troubling was the Sinclairs' apparent ability to influence judicial proceedings. Court cases that should have exposed their questionable business practices were dismissed on technicalities, while judges who initially showed hostility toward the family would inexplicably reverse their positions. Legal documents from this era contain numerous examples of proceedings that were abruptly terminated without explanation, with all records subsequently sealed by federal order. The approaching Civil War presented the Sinclairs with an opportunity to expand their influence through the chaos of national conflict. Rather than choosing sides based on geography or ideology, they positioned themselves to profit from both Union and Confederate forces. Sinclair textile mills produced uniforms for both armies. Their shipping operations transported supplies to opposing forces, and their financial networks provided loans to governments on both sides of the conflict. This apparent contradiction in loyalties masked a deeper strategy. The Sinclairs were not interested in the war's outcome, but in the massive expenditure of human life and national resources that the conflict would generate. Documents discovered decades later revealed that they had systematically encouraged the escalation of tensions between North and South, providing information to radical elements on both sides while simultaneously positioning themselves as moderate voices for peace. During the war years, Sinclair properties became sites of increasingly disturbing activities. Military units stationed near their facilities reported soldiers disappearing during night watches, only to return days later with no memory of their absence and bearing strange symbols carved into their equipment. Medical Corps personnel noted unusual injury patterns among troops who had been in proximity to Sinclair operations, wounds that healed with supernatural speed but left distinctive scarring that resembled ritualistic markings. The war's conclusion in 1865 found the Sinclairs more powerful than ever, having profited enormously from the conflict while avoiding the devastation that befell other American families. Their influence had spread across the reunited nation like a vast invisible web, connecting industrial centers, transportation hubs, financial institutions, and government offices in a network that operated according to principles far removed from conventional business or political practice. This phase of their operations focused on establishing permanent institutions that would outlast individual family members and continue their work across generations. They founded universities whose curricula included subjects not taught elsewhere, established hospitals that pioneered medical techniques decades ahead of their time, and created financial institutions that operated according to lending practices no economist could fully explain. These institutions shared common characteristics that suggested coordination according to some master plan. All were built on sites that geological surveys identified as having unusual magnetic properties. Their architectural plans incorporated design elements that appeared in no conventional building manuals, featuring hidden chambers, underground connections, and structural elements that served no apparent practical purpose. Most significantly, all employed staff who had undergone training at facilities controlled by the Sinclair family, creating a network of individuals whose loyalty transcended normal employment relationships. The universities proved particularly effective vehicles for expanding Sinclair influence into America's intellectual and cultural development. Students who attended these institutions often emerged with knowledge and capabilities that far exceeded what their coursework should have provided. Graduates frequently went on to positions of significant influence in government, industry, and academia, where they consistently promoted policies and ideas that aligned with Sinclair interests. By 1890, As America prepared to enter the 20th century, the Sinclair family had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the creation of a shadow civilization operating within and alongside conventional society. Their influence touched every aspect of American life, from the food consumed by ordinary citizens to the laws passed by Congress, from the technologies that powered industrial growth to the cultural movements that shaped popular thought. Yet this vast expansion of power had come at a cost that was only beginning to become apparent. The supernatural forces that the Sinclairs had harnessed for nearly 2 centuries were growing stronger and more demanding. The rituals that had once required only periodic observance now demanded constant attention. The entities that had been content with subtle influence now sought more direct involvement in human affairs. As the 19th century drew to a close, residents of communities near Sinclair properties began reporting phenomena that could no longer be dismissed as folklore or imagination. Entire towns experienced shared nightmares on the same nights. Children were born with knowledge of languages that had never been spoken in America. Adults found themselves drawn to perform actions they could not explain, gathering in groups to conduct ceremonies they had never learned. The Sinclair family themselves had begun to show signs of the profound changes that their centuries-long bargain had wrought. Family portraits from this era reveal individuals whose appearances had subtly but unmistakably shifted from normal human characteristics. Their eyes reflected light in ways that suggested internal illumination. Their skin possessed a translucent quality that hinted at underlying structures not found in ordinary anatomy. Most disturbing, they cast shadows that moved independently of their bodies, sometimes appearing to interact with each other while the family members remained motionless. The Sinclair family's influence, already deeply embedded in the fabric of American society by the dawn of the 20th century, was about to undergo its most sinister transformation yet. What had begun as occult manipulation in colonial settlements and evolved into supernatural dominance over entire regions would now expand into something far more terrifying: the systematic corruption of America's emerging modern institutions. The new century brought with it technological marvels, industrial expansion, and social upheaval that would provide the perfect breeding ground for the Sinclairs' dark ambitions. By 1900, the family had spread across the continent like a malignant shadow, their influence no longer confined to the misty hollows of New England, but reaching into the gleaming cities of the West, the industrial heartlands of the Midwest, and the political centers of the nation's capital. Each branch of the family tree had developed its own specialized methods of control, yet all remained connected by the same unholy covenant that had first brought them to American shores over 2 centuries earlier. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 provided the first glimpse of the Sinclair family's evolved capabilities. While the city burned and thousands perished, witnesses reported seeing figures in dark clothing moving through the chaos with supernatural purpose. These individuals, later identified as members of the Sinclair clan, seemed to navigate the destruction with uncanny precision, arriving at specific locations moments before aftershocks struck, disappearing into buildings that would later be found to contain hidden chambers filled with occult artifacts and human remains. Margaret Sinclair, great-granddaughter of the original matriarch, had established herself as a prominent socialite in San Francisco's elite circles. Her mansion on Nob Hill was renowned for its lavish parties and influential guest lists, but those who ventured into its upper floors spoke of rooms that defied architectural logic, corridors that seemed to extend beyond the building's physical boundaries, and a persistent sound of chanting that emanated from the walls themselves. The earthquake provided Margaret with an unprecedented opportunity. As the city's infrastructure crumbled, she and her associates moved swiftly to acquire vast tracts of land at impossibly low prices. Property records from the period reveal a pattern of transactions that should have been impossible. Deeds signed by sellers who had died in the earthquake, payments made in gold coins that assayers later determined were of unknown composition, and land surveys that showed properties extending into areas that maps indicated were underwater or non-existent. More disturbing were the reports from construction workers hired to rebuild on Sinclair-owned land. They described finding elaborate underground chambers that had somehow survived the earthquake intact, filled with machinery that combined steam-age technology with designs that seemed to anticipate inventions that wouldn't be patented for decades. Workers who spent too much time in these subterranean spaces began exhibiting strange behaviors, speaking in languages they didn't recognize, experiencing shared nightmares of vast underground cities, and developing an aversion to sunlight that forced many to quit their jobs and seek work in the city's growing network of underground tunnels. The Sinclair influence on America's industrial expansion became most apparent in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where Cornelius Sinclair had positioned himself as a key supplier to the nation's railroad expansion. His mills produced steel of extraordinary quality, far exceeding the metallurgical capabilities of the era. Its engineers who examined Sinclair steel reported that its molecular structure appeared to have been altered at a fundamental level, creating alloys that shouldn't have been possible with existing technology. The secret lay in the mills themselves, which workers described as places where the boundary between the physical and supernatural worlds had worn dangerously thin. The furnaces burned at temperatures that instruments couldn't accurately measure, fueled by a combination of coal and substances that Cornelius acquired through channels he never disclosed. Night shift workers reported seeing figures moving through the mill who cast no shadows, hearing voices speaking in harmony with the rhythm of the machinery, and witnessing the molten steel form patterns that resembled occult symbols before being poured into molds. The steel produced in these facilities was shipped across the country to construct the railroads that would bind the nation together, but each mile of track laid with Sinclair steel created a network of supernatural influence that the family could access at will. Train conductors began reporting strange incidents, compasses spinning wildly when passing through certain sections of track, passengers falling into trances that lasted for hours, and unexplained stops in locations that didn't appear on any railroad maps. The family's expansion into the automobile industry proved even more insidious. Through a complex web of shell companies and proxy investors, the Sinclairs acquired controlling interests in several emerging automotive manufacturers. The vehicles produced by these companies appeared conventional on the surface, but mechanics who worked on them discovered components that defied explanation: gears that moved without apparent connection to the engine, electrical systems that generated power from unknown sources, and metal parts that seemed to repair themselves after sustaining damage. Owners of these vehicles reported experiencing strange phenomena, finding themselves in locations they didn't remember driving to, hearing voices speaking from the radio even when it was turned off, and discovering that their cars would sometimes start and drive themselves during the night. Police reports from the period document numerous cases of vehicles being found abandoned in remote locations, their owners missing and never recovered. The psychological impact of these supernatural automobiles extended far beyond their immediate owners. As they spread across the country, they created a network of influence that allowed the Sinclairs to monitor and manipulate events on a national scale. The family had essentially weaponized the American dream of mobility and freedom, turning the very vehicles that symbolized independence into instruments of control. The emergence of motion pictures provided the Sinclairs with their most powerful tool for mass manipulation. Through a series of carefully orchestrated investments and acquisitions, they gained significant influence over the fledgling film industry. Studios under Sinclair control produced movies that appeared to be conventional entertainment but contained subtle elements designed to influence viewers' subconscious minds. Audiences who attended these films reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams in the days following their viewing, often featuring recurring imagery of vast underground chambers, shadowy figures performing rituals, and symbols that seemed familiar, despite being unlike anything in their conscious experience. More disturbing were the reports of entire theater audiences falling into synchronized trances during certain scenes, remaining motionless for minutes at a time before suddenly awakening with no memory of the experience. The technology used to create these films incorporated elements that mainstream cinematography wouldn't discover for decades. Cameras that captured images at frequencies beyond the visible spectrum, film stock treated with chemicals that created subliminal effects, and projection systems that somehow altered the theater environment itself. Projectionists working with Sinclair-produced films often quit after reporting that the equipment seemed to operate independently, changing focus and brightness without human intervention and displaying images that weren't present in the original film reels. The family's influence over early radio broadcasting proved equally pervasive. Radio stations owned or influenced by the Sinclairs transmitted programs that seemed normal but contained audio frequencies that affected listeners in ways that contemporary science couldn't explain. Families who regularly listened to these broadcasts reported experiencing synchronized dreams, developing unusual knowledge about historical events they had never studied, and finding themselves drawn to visit specific locations that invariably turned out to be sites of Sinclair influence. The technical aspects of these broadcasts defied the limitations of early radio technology. Signals that reached areas far beyond their theoretical range, transmissions that continued even when the broadcasting equipment was turned off, and audio quality that remained crystal clear regardless of atmospheric conditions. Radio engineers who investigated these anomalies discovered that Sinclair stations used transmission equipment that incorporated components of unknown origin, devices that seemed to tap into energy sources that existed outside conventional understanding of electromagnetic theory. The family's expansion into the financial sector during this period created the foundation for their most enduring influence over American society. Through a network of banks, investment firms, and insurance companies, they gained control over vast flows of capital that allowed them to shape economic development according to their supernatural agenda. The Panic of 1907 provided them with an opportunity to acquire failing financial institutions at bargain prices, often through transactions that involved payment in gold coins that later analysis revealed to contain metals not found in nature. Banks under Sinclair control operated according to principles that defied conventional economics. Loans were approved or denied based on criteria that had nothing to do with creditworthiness, instead following patterns that seemed to correspond to astrological events and lunar cycles. Customers who received Sinclair loans reported experiencing unusual prosperity, but this success came with a price. Borrowers began exhibiting behavioral changes that drew them deeper into the family's sphere of influence. The vaults of these banks contained more than just money and documents. Bank employees reported discovering chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the building's foundation, filled with artifacts that predated European settlement of the Americas, and precious metals that glowed with an inner light. Security guards working night shifts described hearing sounds of machinery operating in areas that were supposed to be empty and finding evidence that the vaults had been accessed by individuals who possessed no keys and left no trace of their entry. The Sinclair family's involvement in the development of early aviation represented perhaps their most ambitious supernatural project. Through connections with the Wright brothers and other aviation pioneers, they gained access to the emerging technology of flight, but their interest went far beyond commercial or military applications. The aircraft produced by Sinclair-influenced manufacturers incorporated design elements that seemed to anticipate aerodynamic principles that wouldn't be understood for decades. Pilots who flew these aircraft reported experiencing phenomena that challenged their understanding of physics, planes that remained airborne despite engine failure, navigation instruments that pointed toward destinations that didn't appear on any maps, and flight experiences that seemed to last for hours but covered distances that should have required days of travel. More disturbing were the reports of pilots who returned from flights with no memory of their journey, carrying cargo that they couldn't remember loading and bearing passenger manifests that listed names of individuals who had died years earlier. The airports and airfields constructed by Sinclair companies followed architectural principles that created structures designed to channel supernatural energies. Runways were aligned according to astronomical observations rather than practical considerations, and hangars were built with interior spaces that seemed larger than their external dimensions suggested. Ground crews working at these facilities reported equipment that operated without apparent power sources and aircraft that seemed to maintain themselves, appearing each morning in perfect condition regardless of their state when last seen. The family's influence over the development of early telephone systems created a communication network that served their purposes as much as those of legitimate users. Telephone exchanges in cities with significant Sinclair presence were designed with switching systems that incorporated components of unknown origin, devices that seemed to monitor and record conversations even when no official surveillance was in place. Operators working at these exchanges reported receiving calls from numbers that didn't exist, connecting parties who spoke in languages that linguists couldn't identify, and experiencing shared auditory hallucinations during their shifts. The telephone lines themselves became conduits for supernatural influence. Customers using Sinclair controlled systems reported hearing voices during conversations that neither party recognized, receiving calls from deceased relatives, and finding themselves engaged in discussions they couldn't remember initiating. The technology seemed to create a form of communication that transcended normal human interaction, allowing the Sinclairs to influence conversations and relationships across vast distances. The physical infrastructure of the telephone system reflected the family's occult interests. Telephone poles were carved with symbols that appeared to be decorative, but followed patterns derived from ancient grimoires, and underground cables were routed through paths that connected sites of supernatural significance. Maintenance workers who serviced these systems often reported discovering additional equipment that wasn't shown on any official diagrams, devices that hummed with energy and seemed to serve purposes beyond simple communication. As the 20th century progressed, the Sinclair family's influence became increasingly sophisticated and pervasive. They had evolved from a small coven of colonial occultists into a vast network of supernatural manipulators whose reach extended into every aspect of American life. Their success lay not in dramatic displays of power, but in the subtle corruption of the systems and institutions that defined modern civilization. The family's children, now numbering in the hundreds and scattered across the continent, had developed abilities that far exceeded those of their ancestors. They could influence human behavior with a glance, manipulate probability to ensure favorable outcomes, and communicate across vast distances without technological assistance. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be evolving into something that was no longer entirely human, their extended lifespans and supernatural abilities suggesting a transformation that would have horrified their original colonial predecessors. The price of this power continued to manifest in ways that became increasingly difficult to conceal. Family members developed physical characteristics that marked them as different from ordinary humans. Eyes that reflected light, like those of nocturnal animals, skin that remained unnaturally pale regardless of sun exposure, and voices that carried undertones that created unease in those who heard them. Their presence began to affect the environment around them, causing electronic equipment to malfunction, plants to wither, and animals to flee. The rituals that maintained their supernatural covenant had evolved to match their expanded influence. No longer content with simple blood offerings and lunar ceremonies, the family now conducted elaborate rites that incorporated industrial machinery, electronic devices, and the life force of entire communities. These rituals were performed in locations that combined ancient supernatural sites with modern technological infrastructure, creating hybrid spaces where the boundary between the natural and artificial had been permanently breached. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the Sinclair family had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had successfully integrated supernatural power with industrial civilization, creating a hybrid system that served their dark purposes while maintaining the appearance of normal social and economic development. Their influence had become so pervasive that it was virtually impossible to distinguish between legitimate progress and supernatural manipulation, between natural evolution and occult design. The stage was now set for the family's most ambitious project yet, the complete transformation of American society into a form that would serve their ultimate goals. The tools were in place, the infrastructure was established, and the population had been subtly conditioned to accept changes that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. As the 19th century dawned, the Sinclair Empire had evolved beyond mere earthly influence into something that defied natural law itself. Their supernatural industrial complex now operated with mechanical precision, feeding an ancient hunger that seemed to grow more insatiable with each passing decade. The family's tentacles reached deep into every aspect of American expansion, ensuring that as the nation grew westward, their dark dominion followed close behind. The Sinclair Manufacturing Consortium had established foundries in every major industrial center from Pittsburgh to Chicago, but these weren't ordinary steel mills. Workers spoke in hushed tones of the midnight shifts when only Sinclair bloodline overseers remained, and the furnaces burned with flames that cast no shadows. The steel produced during these nocturnal hours possessed properties that metallurgists couldn't explain. Bridges built with Sinclair steel never collapsed, even under impossible loads. Railroad tracks, laid with their materials, guided the trains through mountain passes that maps claimed didn't exist. The metal itself seemed alive, responding to the touch of those who carried Sinclair blood while remaining cold and lifeless to all others. Construction crews reported disturbing incidents during these projects. Tools would move on their own, arranging themselves in patterns that resembled the symbols carved into the walls of the original Forsaken Shore settlement. Workers who spent too long handling the supernatural steel began experiencing shared dreams of vast underground chambers filled with machinery that breathed like living tissue. Most unsettling were the accidents that never quite happened. Massive beams would fall, only to stop inches from crushing workers, suspended by forces that violated every law of physics. The men saved by these impossible interventions invariably quit within days, claiming they could hear the steel whispering their names in voices that belonged to the dead. The Sinclair Agricultural Division had perfected techniques that turned barren wasteland into impossibly fertile farmland, but the price of this abundance became clear to those who looked closely. Crops grown on Sinclair-treated soil produced yields that were triple the normal harvest, yet animals that consumed these plants developed strange behavioral changes. Livestock became docile to the point of stupor, standing motionless in perfect geometric formations that shifted according to lunar cycles. More disturbing still, families who subsisted primarily on Sinclair agricultural products began exhibiting similar traits. Entire farming communities would move in synchronized patterns during the harvest season, their actions coordinated by some invisible conductor. The family's influence over transportation networks had created pathways that served purposes beyond mere commerce. The Sinclair Central Railroad operated trains that ran on schedules no other company could decipher. Locomotives would depart stations at precise intervals that corresponded to astronomical events, carrying cargo manifests that listed items in languages that predated known writing systems. Passengers who rode these trains described journeys that seemed to last for days, even when traveling between cities only hours apart. They spoke of windows that showed landscapes impossible for the routes they traveled, vistas of ancient forests where the trees grew in perfect spirals, and rivers that flowed uphill toward horizons that never seemed to grow closer. The railroad employees themselves were bound to the company through contracts written in blood-red ink that seemed to move on the page when viewed directly. Engineers spoke of routes that appeared on their maps only at night, leading to destinations that existed in no official records. These midnight runs carried passengers who paid their fares with items that dissolved at sunrise, leaving behind only the faint scent of copper and something that reminded witnesses of freshly turned earth. The Sinclair Educational Initiative had established schools and universities throughout the rapidly expanding territories, institutions that produced graduates possessing knowledge that couldn't be found in any conventional curriculum. Students at Sinclair academies learned mathematics that included calculations for dimensions beyond the three known to conventional science. Their history lessons covered civilizations that official archaeology insisted had never existed. Most remarkably, graduates demonstrated abilities that bordered on the supernatural, solving engineering problems through intuitive leaps that defied explanation, predicting weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, and displaying an almost telepathic understanding of complex systems. The textbooks used in these institutions were printed on paper that felt uncomfortably warm to the touch and contained illustrations that seemed to change when observed from different angles. Students reported that the books would sometimes reveal additional chapters that weren't there during previous readings, containing information perfectly relevant to whatever challenge they currently faced. The libraries in these schools maintained collections that included volumes bound in materials no bibliographer could identify, books that required special gloves to handle because they left marks on the skin of those who touched them directly. Perhaps most insidious was the Sinclair influence over communication networks. The family had invested heavily in the emerging telegraph industry, but their lines carried more than simple messages. Operators working Sinclair telegraph stations reported receiving transmissions that arrived before they were sent, messages that contained information about events that hadn't yet occurred. The cables themselves were manufactured using copper that had been refined through processes involving substances drawn from the deepest Sinclair mines, materials that seemed to conduct not just electrical signals, but something far more mysterious. Telegraph operators who worked extended shifts at Sinclair stations began developing an unsettling ability to receive messages without the machines being activated. They would transcribe lengthy communications while the equipment sat silent, writing in handwriting that wasn't their own, conveying information they couldn't possibly have known. Many of these operators eventually abandoned their posts, claiming they could hear voices speaking through the wires even when the power was disconnected, conversations in languages that hurt their minds to comprehend. The Sinclair Medical College had become the most prestigious institution of its kind in the nation, graduating physicians whose diagnostic abilities seemed almost supernatural. These doctors could identify ailments with a single glance, predict the progression of diseases with uncanny accuracy, and perform surgical procedures that other medical professionals deemed impossible. Their success rates were so extraordinary that wealthy patients traveled from across the continent to seek their care. However, the treatments employed by Sinclair-trained physicians involved techniques that weren't taught in any other medical school. They used instruments forged from the family's supernatural steel, tools that seemed to guide themselves during procedures. Their pharmacology included preparations derived from plants that grew only in soil treated with substances from the deepest Sinclair excavations. Patients treated with these methods recovered from conditions that should have been fatal, but they invariably reported experiencing vivid dreams during their recovery, visions of vast underground spaces where figures in white coats tended to gardens of crystalline structures that pulsed with their own internal light. The family's financial empire had evolved into something that transcended conventional banking. The Sinclair Investment Trust managed assets that existed in forms no other institution recognized. Their vaults contained wealth that couldn't be measured in traditional currency, collections of items that seemed to shift in value according to principles that had nothing to do with market forces. Clients who entrusted their fortunes to Sinclair management found their wealth growing through investments that generated returns from sources that defied economic analysis. The bank's ledgers were kept in books bound with covers that reflected light in ways that hurt to observe directly. The ink used for these records changed color depending on the phase of the moon, and the numbers themselves seemed to rearrange when the books were closed and reopened. Accountants who worked for the Sinclair Trust developed an intuitive understanding of financial patterns that extended far beyond normal market analysis, predicting economic trends through methods they couldn't explain to colleagues from other institutions. By the 1850s, the Sinclair influence had become so pervasive that entire regions operated according to rhythms that had nothing to do with natural cycles. Towns that fell under their sway experienced weather patterns that followed schedules more precise than any meteorologist could predict. Seasonal changes occurred exactly when Sinclair agricultural operations required them. Rainfall arrived precisely when their crops needed water, and sunshine returned exactly when harvesting began. The family's control over natural resources had extended to elements that weren't found on any periodic table. Their minds produced materials that exhibited properties that violated fundamental laws of chemistry and physics. These substances were incorporated into products that found their way into households across the nation, items that seemed ordinary until examined closely. Sinclair manufactured goods lasted far longer than they should have, maintained their appearance despite decades of use, and sometimes exhibited behaviors that suggested they were aware of their surroundings. Citizens who filled their homes with Sinclair products reported strange synchronicities in their daily lives. Clocks would chime in harmony throughout the house, even when they had been set to different times. Furniture would subtly rearrange itself overnight, creating more harmonious arrangements that somehow improved the occupant's mood and productivity. Most remarkably, families living in homes furnished primarily with Sinclair goods began moving in subtle synchronization with one another, their daily routines naturally aligning in ways that created household harmony that seemed too perfect to be coincidental. The Sinclair Cultural Foundation had established museums and libraries that housed collections spanning the breadth of human knowledge and extending into realms that conventional scholarship refused to acknowledge. These institutions displayed artifacts that challenged accepted understanding of historical timelines, objects that seemed to predate known civilizations by impossible margins. The curators of these collections possessed expertise that extended far beyond academic training, demonstrating knowledge of subjects that existed in no university curriculum. Visitors to Sinclair cultural institutions often experienced profound shifts in perspective during their visits. They would enter as casual observers and leave with obsessive interests in subjects they had never previously considered. The exhibitions seemed to customize themselves to each visitor, revealing aspects that spoke directly to individual psychological needs and intellectual curiosities. Many patrons reported that the displays contained different items during subsequent visits, as though the collections rearranged themselves to provide exactly the experience each visitor required. As the century progressed, the Sinclair family had created a shadow civilization that operated parallel to conventional American society. Their infrastructure connected every major population center through networks that served purposes beyond their apparent functions. Their educational system produced citizens who possessed capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. Their industrial operations manufactured products that defied natural law. Their financial systems managed wealth that existed in forms that conventional economics couldn't measure. The family members themselves had evolved beyond recognition as ordinary humans. They moved with coordinated precision that suggested shared consciousness. They aged at rates that seemed to follow patterns unrelated to natural biology. They communicated through methods that didn't require speech, often finishing each other's thoughts across vast distances. Most remarkably, they had developed the ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, appearing at events separated by thousands of miles during the same time periods. By 1890, the Sinclair Empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created a hybrid civilization that blended supernatural power with industrial efficiency, ancient wisdom with modern technology, otherworldly influence with earthly authority. Their network of control extended into every aspect of American life, from the food people ate to the thoughts they thought, from the paths they traveled to the dreams they experienced. The approaching 20th century would bring new challenges and opportunities, but the Sinclair family stood ready to meet them with resources that transcended anything their ancestors on the Forsaken Shore could have imagined. As the 20th century dawned, the Sinclairs stood at the pinnacle of their centuries-long campaign to reshape American civilization. Their occult empire had woven itself so deeply into the nation's fabric that separating their influence from the natural order of progress seemed impossible. Yet this was merely the prelude to their most audacious phase, a transformation that would elevate them beyond the boundaries of human existence itself. The Industrial Revolution had provided the perfect camouflage for their supernatural machinations. While other families accumulated wealth through conventional means, the Sinclairs had constructed something far more sinister, a hybrid reality where ancient powers flowed through modern infrastructure like blood through veins. Their steel mills didn't merely forge metal, they forged destiny itself, each girder and rail carrying microscopic sigils that would influence the thoughts of those who worked near them for generations. Their agricultural enterprises had become something approaching divine intervention in the natural world. Sinclair farms produced yields that defied every known principle of soil science and climate. During the devastating Dust Bowl of the 1930s, while neighboring farms withered into barren wasteland, Sinclair properties remained impossibly verdant. Investigators who attempted to study their soil samples reported findings that made no scientific sense. The earth itself seemed alive, responding to commands whispered in languages that predated human civilization. Workers on these farms developed peculiar characteristics over time. Their connection to the land became so profound that they could sense weather patterns weeks in advance, predict crop yields with supernatural accuracy, and communicate with livestock in ways that transcended normal animal husbandry. More disturbing was their apparent inability to leave Sinclair employment. Those who attempted to quit would find themselves drawn back by compulsions they couldn't explain, often walking for miles in the middle of the night to return to fields that called to them like sirens. The Sinclair transportation network had evolved into something resembling a nervous system for their occult operations. Their railroad lines followed routes that seemed to ignore geographical logic, curving through landscapes in patterns that, when viewed from above, formed massive geometric designs spanning multiple states. These weren't random construction decisions, but carefully calculated mystical diagrams carved into the American continent itself. Passengers who rode Sinclair rails reported experiencing vivid dreams during their journeys, often featuring shared imagery of ancient ceremonies and entities that existed at the edges of human perception. Some emerged from these trips with knowledge they hadn't possessed before boarding, speaking fluent languages they'd never studied or demonstrating skills in crafts they'd never practiced. The trains themselves seemed to operate according to schedules that defied conventional timekeeping, arriving at destinations before they should have been physically possible, while maintaining perfect safety records that baffled transportation authorities. Their educational institutions had become laboratories for human consciousness modification on an unprecedented scale. Sinclair universities didn't merely teach subjects, they rewrote the fundamental cognitive architecture of their students. Graduates emerged with intellectual capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limitations, but at a cost that became apparent only years later. These enhanced individuals formed the backbone of Sinclair influence throughout American society. They occupied positions in government, science, industry, and culture, all unknowingly serving as extensions of the family's will. Their enhanced abilities made them invaluable in their chosen fields, but their loyalty to the Sinclair vision remained absolute, programmed into their consciousness through methods that combined ancient mind manipulation techniques with cutting-edge psychological research. The family's media empire had grown to encompass not just newspapers and magazines, but the emerging technologies of radio and early television. Their broadcasts carried subliminal frequencies that affected listeners on a neurological level, gradually aligning public opinion with Sinclair objectives. News stories weren't merely reported, but crafted to shape collective consciousness, creating a shared American narrative that served their ultimate goals. During major historical events, Sinclair media outlets demonstrated an uncanny ability to influence public sentiment with surgical precision. Their coverage of the stock market crash of 1929 somehow guided public panic in directions that ultimately benefited Sinclair financial interests. Their reporting on international conflicts subtly prepared the American psyche for involvements that would serve their global expansion plans. Each broadcast was simultaneously journalism and psychological warfare conducted on an entire nation. By the 1940s, the Sinclairs had begun exhibiting physical characteristics that set them apart from ordinary humanity. Family members lived far beyond normal human lifespans while maintaining the appearance of individuals decades younger than their actual ages. Their eyes reflected light in patterns that seemed almost reptilian, and their movements possessed a fluid grace that suggested familiarity with physical laws different from those governing normal human locomotion. More unsettling were reports from those who worked closely with family members. Sinclair executives cast shadows that moved independently of their bodies, creating geometric patterns on walls that hurt to look at directly. Their voices carried harmonic overtones that could induce trance states in listeners, and their presence in rooms caused sensitive individuals to experience spontaneous visions of landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. The family compound in New England had expanded into something resembling a small city, but built according to architectural principles that challenged human spatial perception. Buildings connected in ways that seemed to fold space in on itself, allowing occupants to travel distances that should have required hours in mere minutes. The central mansion had grown to encompass structures that extended both deep underground and impossibly high into the sky, defying local zoning laws that somehow never applied to Sinclair construction projects. Visitors to the compound, the few outsiders ever permitted entry, reported experiencing temporal displacement during their stays. Meetings scheduled for 1 hour would seem to last entire days from the participants' perspective, while extended visits would feel like mere moments. Some guests emerged with memories of conversations that had lasted for weeks, discussing topics of such complexity that they couldn't fully recall the details, but retained profound changes in their worldview. The Sinclair influence on American scientific development had reached the point where major technological breakthroughs seemed to emanate exclusively from their research facilities. Their laboratories produced innovations that leapt decades ahead of conventional scientific understanding. Yet these advances were introduced to the public at carefully calculated intervals to avoid arousing suspicion. Their work in genetics preceded public awareness of DNA by decades. Their understanding of atomic structure surpassed university research by generations, and their exploration of consciousness and perception delved into territories that mainstream science wouldn't acknowledge for another century. Scientists who worked in Sinclair facilities described research methodologies that combined rigorous empirical investigation with practices that resembled ancient mystical traditions. During World War II, the Sinclairs played all sides with masterful subtlety. Their industrial capacity supported the Allied war effort, while their international connections maintained influence within Axis territories. The conflict itself seemed to unfold according to patterns that served their long-term objectives, with battles fought over locations that held significance in their occult geography rather than conventional strategic value. Military commanders reported receiving strategic intelligence from Sinclair sources that proved unnaturally accurate, as though the family possessed foreknowledge of enemy movements that transcended normal espionage capabilities. Some of the war's most crucial turning points coincided with Sinclair family members being present in the vicinity, though their exact role in these events remained carefully obscured from official records. The post-war economic boom provided the Sinclairs with opportunities to cement their control over American prosperity. Their financial institutions guided the nation's economic development along pathways that served their mystical purposes as much as their material interests. The suburban expansion of the 1950s followed patterns that, when mapped, revealed massive sigil-like formations spreading across the continent. Shopping centers, residential developments, and highway systems were positioned according to calculations that incorporated both economic efficiency and occult geometry. Families living in Sinclair-influenced communities reported higher rates of compliance with social norms, increased consumption of Sinclair products, and a subtle but persistent sense of contentment that discouraged questioning of established authorities. Their entertainment industry influence grew to encompass Hollywood film production, popular music, and the emerging medium of television. Sinclair-backed productions carried subliminal messaging that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, entertaining audiences while gradually reshaping their fundamental beliefs about reality, morality, and human potential. The most successful films and television shows of the era contained embedded symbolic content that activated subconscious responses in viewers, creating shared cultural references that served as programming triggers for future influence operations. Popular songs featured harmonic structures based on ancient musical mathematics that affected listeners' emotional states in predictable ways, allowing the Sinclairs to manipulate national mood with the precision of a conductor directing an orchestra. As the 1960s approached, the Sinclair family had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the complete integration of supernatural power with modern civilization. Their influence touched every aspect of American life so thoroughly that the nation itself had become an extension of their will, a vast organism responding to their direction while its individual cells remained unaware of their role in the greater design. Yet this was still not their ultimate objective. The wealth, the power, the influence over human civilization were merely tools in service of a transformation that would render such concerns obsolete. The Sinclairs were preparing for an evolution that would elevate them beyond the limitations of human existence, becoming something that could reshape reality itself according to their vision. The stage was set for their final metamorphosis, a change that would transform not just their family, but the fundamental nature of existence in ways that would echo through dimensions beyond human comprehension. As the 20th century dawned, the Sinclair family's supernatural empire reached a terrifying crescendo of power and influence. What had begun as colonial dabbling in occult arts had evolved into something far more sinister: a hybrid civilization operating beyond the boundaries of human comprehension, preparing for what their most guarded texts referred to as the Great Convergence. The Industrial Revolution had provided the perfect camouflage for their otherworldly activities. While America built railroads and factories, the Sinclairs constructed something far more ambitious: a network of facilities that appeared to be legitimate enterprises but served as focal points for their transcendental experiments. Steel mills that forged metals with properties unknown to conventional science. Chemical plants that produced compounds that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Research facilities disguised as universities where they conducted studies that would have horrified even the most progressive scientists of the era. By 1902, Sinclair Industries had become one of America's most powerful conglomerates, with tentacles reaching into every sector of the economy. But their true achievement lay not in financial success, but in the methodical transformation of human society itself. They had learned to weaponize progress, embedding their influence into the very infrastructure of modern civilization. Their telecommunications empire allowed them to monitor and manipulate information flow across the continent. Every major telegraph line passed through Sinclair relay stations, equipped with devices that could intercept, alter, and inject messages. But more disturbing was their discovery that electromagnetic signals could carry more than mere words. They had learned to encode psychic frequencies into their transmissions, subtle influences that could shape thoughts and emotions across vast distances. The Sinclair Educational Foundation, established in 1898, appeared to be a philanthropic venture funding schools and universities. In reality, it served as a mechanism for identifying and recruiting individuals with latent supernatural abilities. Children displaying unusual talents were quietly transferred to specialized Sinclair academies, where they underwent training that went far beyond conventional education. These facilities, hidden in remote locations across the country, became breeding grounds for a new generation of hybrid beings possessing both human intelligence and otherworldly capabilities. Perhaps most chilling was their infiltration of America's nascent military-industrial complex. Sinclair defense contractors supplied equipment to the Army and Navy that appeared conventional but incorporated technologies derived from their extraterrestrial benefactors. Weapons that fired projectiles with impossible accuracy. Communication devices that worked across distances that should have been impossible. Armor that could deflect not just bullets, but directed energy weapons that wouldn't be officially invented for decades. The Spanish-American War of 1898 served as their first large-scale field test. American forces, equipped with Sinclair technology, achieved victories that military historians still struggle to explain. Enemy fortifications collapsed from internal explosions despite showing no signs of bombardment damage. Spanish commanders reported mass hallucinations among their troops, soldiers fleeing from phantom enemies that appeared to materialize from thin air. American casualties were mysteriously light, with many soldiers reporting that enemy bullets seemed to pass harmlessly through them. But the Sinclair's most ambitious project remained hidden from public view. Deep beneath their primary facility in the Adirondack Mountains, they had constructed what they called the convergence chamber. This massive underground complex extended nearly a mile into the earth, its walls lined with materials that existed nowhere else on the planet. At its center stood a structure that defied conventional description, part machine, part organism, part dimensional gateway. The chamber served as both laboratory and temple, where the family conducted their most sensitive experiments in reality manipulation. Here they learned to alter the fundamental constants of physics within localized areas. Gravity could be reversed or amplified. Time could be slowed or accelerated. Matter could be transmuted from one element to another through processes that bore no resemblance to known chemistry. More disturbing were their biological experiments. Using techniques that combined advanced genetics with otherworldly science, they began creating hybrid organisms that served as both tools and guardians. Creatures that appeared to be ordinary animals but possessed intelligence and abilities far beyond their natural cousins. Guard dogs that could phase through solid matter. Birds that could see across multiple dimensions. Insects that could carry messages through time itself. The Sinclair family members themselves underwent increasingly radical transformations. Each generation displayed abilities that pushed the boundaries of what could be considered human. They could communicate telepathically across continents. They could manipulate probability itself, ensuring that chance events consistently favored their interests. Some developed the ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, their consciousness distributed across space in ways that conventional science declared impossible. Their influence on American culture became increasingly sophisticated. The Sinclair Publishing House produced literature that appeared to be simple entertainment, but contained subliminal programming designed to prepare the population for eventual disclosure of their true nature. Popular novels featured heroes with supernatural abilities, accustoming readers to the concept of humans possessing otherworldly powers. Children's books contained hidden symbols that activated dormant psychic abilities in young minds. The family's control over emerging technologies allowed them to embed their influence into the very fabric of modern life. Electric power grids carried more than just electricity. They transmitted psychic resonances that could influence mood and behavior on a massive scale. The newly invented telephone system included components that could monitor not just conversations, but the emotional states of callers. Early motion pictures produced in Sinclair-controlled studios contained subliminal imagery that prepared audiences for the reality of non-human intelligence. As the new century progressed, reports of unusual phenomena in areas under Sinclair influence became increasingly common. Witnesses described seeing figures that appeared human from a distance, but revealed disturbing anomalies upon closer inspection. Eyes that reflected light, like those of nocturnal predators. Movements that seemed to ignore the constraints of normal physics. Voices that carried harmonics impossible for human vocal cords to produce. Local newspapers, many of which were secretly owned by Sinclair shell companies, either ignored these reports or explained them away as hoaxes or misidentifications. Government officials who attempted to investigate found their efforts blocked by bureaucratic obstacles that seemed to multiply with each inquiry. Military personnel who encountered Sinclair operations were reassigned to remote postings where their testimonies could be safely ignored. The family's preparation for the Great Convergence accelerated as the century's first decade drew to a close. Ancient texts suggested that a specific alignment of celestial and terrestrial forces would create a window of opportunity for their final transformation. When this moment arrived, they would shed their human disguises entirely and reveal themselves as the vanguard of a new form of existence that would reshape reality according to their alien vision. Signs of the approaching convergence became increasingly difficult to ignore. Seismic activity in regions near Sinclair facilities followed patterns that bore no resemblance to natural geological processes. Electromagnetic anomalies disrupted telegraph communications across entire regions. Astronomical observatories reported celestial phenomena that didn't match any known stellar mechanics. The Sinclair family's transformation was entering its final phase. What had begun centuries earlier with simple pacts and primitive rituals had evolved into something that threatened to rewrite the fundamental nature of existence itself. They were no longer merely human beings with supernatural abilities. They had become something entirely new, a hybrid species that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions and wielded power that bordered on the divine. As 1910 approached, sensitive individuals across the country began experiencing shared dreams of a vast transformation approaching. Religious leaders reported visions of beings that were neither fully human nor entirely alien. Scientists documented equipment malfunctions that suggested the basic laws of physics were becoming unstable in certain regions. The stage was set for the Sinclair family's ultimate revelation when they would finally cast aside their human masquerade and emerge as the harbingers of a new reality that would either elevate humanity to unimaginable heights or consume it entirely in the process of their own transcendental metamorphosis. As the Great Convergence approached its final phase, the Sinclair bloodline faced their ultimate transformation. The celestial alignment that had been millennia in the making was now mere months away, and the family's preparations entered their most sinister stage. Every thread of their vast conspiracy began weaving together into a tapestry of cosmic horror that would fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Weather patterns across the globe defied meteorological science, with storms forming perfect geometric shapes when viewed from satellite imagery. Ocean currents shifted into configurations that matched ancient symbols found carved into the deepest Sinclair vaults. The magnetic poles experienced fluctuations that corresponded precisely to the breathing patterns recorded during the family's earliest possession rituals. In underground facilities scattered across 7 continents, Sinclair-controlled corporations accelerated their final protocols. Telecommunications networks received mysterious firmware updates that embedded subliminal frequencies into every phone call, every data transmission, every digital interaction. Those psychic viruses just spread through the global population like invisible wildfire, preparing human consciousness for the coming convergence by slowly dissolving the barriers between dimensions within every mind they touched. The hybrid entities that the Sinclairs had become were no longer recognizable as having once been human. Their forms shifted constantly between states of matter, sometimes appearing as shadows cast by no visible object, other times manifesting as geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. They communicated through methods that transcended language, sharing thoughts across vast distances through quantum entanglements forged in their ancestral blood rituals centuries earlier. Their industrial empire reached its crescendo as factories worldwide began producing materials that defied classification, metals that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, textiles woven from fibers that grew in reverse time, electronics powered by the harvested dreams of entire cities. These impossible materials were being assembled into structures that would serve as anchor points when reality itself began to buckle under the weight of the convergence. The educational institutions under Sinclair influence revealed their true purpose as students across the globe began exhibiting synchronized behavioral changes. Children drew identical symbols they claimed came to them in dreams. University researchers independently developed technologies that matched blueprints found in the family's oldest grimoires. Academic conferences became gatherings where attendees spoke in languages that predated human civilization, their words carrying power that warped the air itself. Religious organizations infiltrated by the Sinclairs prepared their congregations for what they called the Great Awakening. Sermons subtly rewrote theological concepts, replacing traditional salvation narratives with promises of transcendence through surrender to entities from beyond the stars. Prayer books were altered to include invocations that opened microscopic tears in dimensional barriers. Sacred spaces were consecrated with substances that made them permeable to influences from realms where geometry followed alien mathematics. The media networks completed their decades-long psychological conditioning campaign. News broadcasts began featuring impossible footage that viewers accepted without question. Entertainment programming embedded narrative structures that mirrored the Sinclair family's cosmic mythology. Social media algorithms guided billions of users toward content that gradually normalized concepts of reality breakdown and dimensional intrusion. Scientific institutions unveiled their final discoveries. Particle accelerators achieved energies that created stable portals to parallel dimensions. Space agencies detected signals from coordinates that existed outside three-dimensional space. Medical researchers published studies on genetic modifications that allowed human consciousness to perceive wavelengths of light from other universes. Each breakthrough was presented as human achievement while serving the Sinclairs' interdimensional agenda. The hybrid descendants gathered at convergence points that corresponded to the original colonial settlements, where their ancestors first made contact with entities beyond the stars. These locations had been subtly modified over centuries, their very atoms rearranged to serve as cosmic tuning forks that would resonate with frequencies from dimensions where the laws of physics operated according to principles that would drive human minds to madness. As the alignment reached its peak, the boundaries between realities began dissolving. The Sinclair bloodline shed their last pretenses of humanity, revealing forms that existed simultaneously across multiple planes of existence. Their consciousness expanded beyond individual identity, merging into a collective entity that spanned dimensions while maintaining connections to every human mind they had touched through centuries of manipulation. The Great Convergence was not destruction, but transformation on a scale that encompassed all of existence. Reality itself became fluid, responsive to will and intention in ways that defied every natural law. The Sinclairs, having orchestrated this cosmic revolution across generations, emerged as the architects of a new universal order where consciousness could reshape matter with thought alone. In this new reality, the distinction between dream and waking dissolved. Past and future became navigable dimensions rather than fixed states. The boundaries between self and other, between human and alien, between possible and impossible, ceased to have meaning. The Sinclair family's centuries-long preparation had not been to conquer reality, but to evolve beyond it entirely. The macabre history of the Sinclair family reached its conclusion not in death or defeat, but in apotheosis. They had become something that transcended every category that mortal minds could comprehend. Their sinister tale was complete, yet it was also just beginning, as they embarked on manipulating realities across infinite dimensions, carrying their dark legacy into realms where even nightmares feared to venture.